The autumn of 1851 had transformed the Illinois prairie into a golden sea of grass that stretched endlessly toward horizons where earth met sky in shimmering waves of heat. For Clara Donovan, a determined Irish immigrant running a remote supply station at the crossroads of 3 major wagon routes, each day brought desperate travelers seeking provisions for their journey west to California's goldfields. But on that fateful October morning, as she spotted a massive dust cloud rising from the eastern trail, she never imagined that throwing herself into the path of 1,000 stampeding cattle would change the course of her entire life, or that pulling 3 Sauk children from beneath the wheels of an overturned wagon would bring their father, Black Hawk's most feared war chief, to her doorstep with 50 painted warriors demanding justice for what the white world had taken from his people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Donovan's trading station as Clara filled water barrels from the hand-pumped well that her late husband had dug 3 summers before his death from cholera. At 26, she had already survived the potato famine that drove her family from County Cork, the brutal Atlantic crossing that claimed her parents, and 2 harsh Illinois winters that tested every survival skill she possessed. The trading station, positioned at the junction where the Oregon Trail met the California and Mormon routes, represented everything she had built from nothing in this unforgiving frontier landscape. Clara paused in her work to study the steady stream of wagons that had been passing for the past week, each loaded with families seeking fortunes in California's goldfields or fertile farmland in Oregon Territory. The Great Western Migration had brought unprecedented business to her isolated outpost, but it had also increased tensions with the Sauk and Fox tribes, whose traditional hunting grounds were being carved into wagon ruts and homestead claims. Her trading station consisted of a sturdy log cabin that served as both store and living quarters, a large barn for housing livestock and supplies, and a blacksmith forge where she repaired wagon wheels and shod horses for travelers willing to pay premium prices for quality work. Clara had learned blacksmithing from watching her husband Patrick work, and necessity had made her competent enough to handle most routine repairs that kept her customers moving toward their distant destinations. The Irish woman's reputation for fair dealing and reliable supplies had spread along the wagon routes, earning her steady business from travelers who appreciated finding civilization in the vast emptiness of the Illinois prairie. Unlike many frontier merchants who charged desperate prices for basic necessities, Clara maintained reasonable rates and often extended credit to families facing unexpected hardships during their westward journey. Her success, however, came at considerable personal cost. The trading station's isolation meant weeks could pass without seeing another woman, and the constant stream of male customers created social complications that required careful navigation. Clara had learned to project confident authority while maintaining appropriate distance from men who might interpret friendliness as romantic availability. Several marriage proposals from lonely travelers had been politely but firmly declined, as Clara valued her hard-won independence too highly to surrender it lightly. The morning routine of preparing for another day of business was interrupted by Thomas Brennan, an Irish immigrant who helped Clara manage the trading station's daily operations. At 43, Thomas had arrived in Illinois, seeking opportunities in the expanding frontier economy, and his experience with livestock and wagon repair made him invaluable for handling the complex logistics of provisioning westward-bound travelers. "Clara, you might want to take a look at what's coming from the east," Thomas called from the barn, his weathered face showing concern as he pointed toward a growing dust cloud on the horizon. "That's not normal wagon train dust. Looks like something big moving fast." Clara climbed onto the barn's roof for a better view, using the telescope her husband had purchased for monitoring approaching weather and distant travelers. What she saw through the lens made her blood run cold. A massive cattle drive was approaching at dangerous speed, with riders frantically trying to control what appeared to be a full-scale stampede heading directly toward the heavily traveled wagon routes. The situation represented every frontier nightmare combined into one disaster. Stampeding cattle could crush anything in their path, while the dust and chaos would create perfect conditions for accidents involving the numerous wagon trains currently using the trail junction. Clara counted at least 6 separate wagon groups within a 2-mile radius of her trading station, including several families with young children who would be particularly vulnerable if the stampede reached the main routes. "Thomas, ring the warning. Bell and signal every wagon in sight," Clara ordered, already calculating the time they had before the stampede reached their location. "Get them off the main trails and behind whatever cover they can find. This is going to be bad." The Irish woman's experience with frontier emergencies kicked in as she rapidly assessed their options. The trading station's position at the trail junction made it both strategically valuable for warning travelers and extremely vulnerable to the approaching disaster. She could evacuate to safety with reasonable confidence of survival, or she could attempt to help coordinate protective measures for the travelers who depended on her outpost for guidance and assistance. Clara chose to stay and fight, as she had during every previous crisis that threatened her carefully built frontier life. The warning bell's urgent clanging echoed across the prairie as Thomas rode hard toward the nearest wagon trains, shouting warnings about the approaching stampede. Clara used signal mirrors to flash alerts to more distant groups, employing the communication system she had developed for coordinating assistance during prairie fires and severe weather emergencies. Through her telescope, Clara could see the stampede's cause. A group of inexperienced drovers had apparently lost control of their herd during what should have been a routine river crossing. The cattle, numbering over 1,000 head, were now running blind with terror, driven by instincts that would keep them moving until exhaustion or obstacles stopped their desperate flight across the prairie. Most terrifying was the realization that the stampede's current path would carry it directly through the trail junction, where multiple wagon routes converged. Unless the cattle could be turned or stopped, they would collide with numerous wagon trains whose occupants had no experience. Dealing with such emergencies, Clara watched in horror as one wagon train attempted to outrun the stampede instead of seeking protective cover. The Kellerman family, German immigrants bound for Oregon with their 3 young children, was pushing their oxen beyond safe limits in a desperate attempt to reach higher ground before the cattle arrived. Their heavily loaded wagons swayed dangerously as they climbed a small rise, wheels threatening to collapse under the strain of increased speed over rough terrain. "They're not going to make it," Clara whispered, recognizing the mathematics of the situation. The stampede would reach the Kellerman wagon long before they could achieve safety on the distant ridge. Other wagon trains were implementing more sensible defensive strategies, unhitching their livestock and securing their wagons behind natural obstacles like rock outcroppings and creek beds that might deflect the charging cattle. But the Kellermans, perhaps panicked by the approaching thunder of hooves, continued their dangerous race toward impossible safety. Clara made a split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Saddling her fastest horse, she rode hard toward the Kellerman wagon, hoping to convince them to abandon their dangerous flight and seek immediate cover. Her intimate knowledge of the local terrain gave her a slight advantage in predicting the stampede's likely path, but the margin for error was shrinking rapidly as the cattle approached the main trail system. As she rode, Clara spotted something that made her heart race with additional terror. A smaller wagon, apparently separated from any larger train, had overturned near a creek crossing about half a mile from her trading station. The wagon's position placed it directly in the stampede's path, and she could see movement around the wreckage, suggesting survivors who might be trapped or injured. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The Irish woman faced an impossible choice. Continue toward the Kellerman family, who might still escape through their own efforts, or divert to the overturned wagon, where people were certainly in immediate mortal danger. Clara chose the overturned wagon. Clara's horse thundered across the prairie, as the sound of the approaching stampede grew from distant rumble to earth-shaking roar. The overturned wagon lay on its side near Willow Creek, where the crossing's muddy approach had apparently caused the accident during what should have been a routine water stop. As she drew closer, Clara could see the disaster's full scope. The wagon had belonged to a family of Sauk Indians who were traveling with papers identifying them as peaceful agricultural workers seeking employment in the growing frontier economy. Such documentation was increasingly necessary for Native Americans who wished to move freely through territories dominated by white settlements and military patrols. 3 children, apparently triplets around 7 years old, were trapped beneath the wagon's heavy wooden frame. Their desperate cries carried clearly across the prairie as they struggled to free themselves from the wreckage that pinned them. Against the creek bank, an adult woman, presumably their mother, lay motionless nearby with blood trickling from a head wound sustained during the violent crash. Clara dismounted while her horse was still moving, rushing toward the trapped children, as the stampede's thunder grew loud enough to feel through the ground. The cattle were less than a mile away and closing fast, their path clearly fixed on the creek crossing where the overturned wagon created an immovable obstacle. "Hold still!" Clara shouted to the terrified children, though she doubted they understood. "English, I'm going to get you out." The wagon's position made rescue extremely difficult. Its heavy frame had settled at an angle that pinned all 3 children simultaneously, while the muddy creek bank provided unstable footing for any attempt to lift or shift the wooden structure. Clara assessed the situation with the practical, problem-solving skills that had kept her alive through numerous frontier emergencies. Working with desperate efficiency, Clara used a broken wagon tongue as a lever, positioning it against a solid rock to create mechanical advantage for lifting. The trapped frame. The children watched with terrified eyes as she strained against the improvised lever, managing to raise the wagon just enough to create a small gap beneath its crushing weight. "Crawl out now," Clara urged, gesturing frantically for the children to escape through the narrow opening she had created. 2 of the triplets, a boy and girl, managed to squeeze free and immediately helped their sister extract herself from the remaining wreckage. The rescue had taken precious minutes that Clara could ill afford. The stampede was now clearly visible, as a wall of dust and thundering hooves that stretched across the entire width of the prairie. The cattle would reach the creek crossing in less than 5 minutes, and Clara's horse was already dancing nervously as animal instincts detected the approaching disaster. Clara quickly examined the unconscious woman, finding a steady pulse despite the head injury. Moving her would be dangerous given the possible spinal damage, but leaving her in the stampede's path would be certain death. The Irish woman made another split-second decision, lifting the injured Sauk woman onto her horse while motioning for the 3 children to follow her toward the only nearby cover that might provide protection. A cluster of large boulders near the creek offered the possibility of shelter, though reaching them required crossing open ground that would leave them exposed if the stampede's path shifted. Clara led the small group at a run, carrying the youngest child when exhaustion slowed her pace, while the injured woman remained draped unconsciously across the horse's back. They reached the boulder cluster with less than 2 minutes to spare. Clara positioned the children in the most protected spot she could find, then covered them with her own body as the earth began to shake with the impact of thousands of hooves approaching the creek crossing. The sound of the approaching cattle. Stampede defied description. It was thunder that never ended, an earthquake that moved across the earth like a living thing, a roar that filled the air so completely that individual thoughts became impossible. Clara pressed herself over the 3 Sauk children, feeling their small bodies trembling beneath her as the wall of cattle swept toward their inadequate shelter. Through gaps in the boulder cluster, Clara caught glimpses of the magnificent and terrifying spectacle. Over 1,000 longhorn cattle, their horns gleaming in the afternoon sun, ran with the desperate energy of creatures fleeing some primal terror. Their eyes rolled white with panic, their breath created clouds of steam in the cool autumn air, and their hooves struck the earth with enough force to shake solid rock. The stampede struck the creek crossing like a brown river of flesh and horn. Most of the cattle plunged directly into the water, their momentum carrying them across the shallow creek and up the opposite bank without pause. But dozens of animals, confused by the overturned wagon and the scent of human presence, milled chaotically near the crossing, their panic making them dangerous even after the main herd had passed. Clara felt the ground shake beneath her as several Cattle passed within yards of their boulder shelter. Dust filled the air so thickly that breathing became difficult, while the noise remained so intense that communication was impossible even by shouting. The Irish woman could only hold the children close and wait for the disaster to pass, praying that their fragile shelter would prove adequate protection against the random violence of panicked animals. One of the triplets, the boy who had been trapped deepest beneath the wagon, clutched Clara's arm with surprising strength. Despite their language differences, his expression communicated perfect understanding of their shared danger and gratitude for her rescue attempt. The moment created a connection that transcended cultural boundaries, linking the Irish immigrant and Sauk child through their mutual struggle for survival. The main body of the stampede passed in less than 10 minutes, but scattered groups of cattle continued milling near the creek for nearly an hour afterward. Clara and the children remained hidden among the boulders, waiting for the confused animals to wander away before attempting to assess the damage to both the landscape and the injured woman who had remained unconscious throughout the entire ordeal. When silence finally returned to the prairie, Clara emerged cautiously to survey the destruction. The creek crossing had been transformed into a churned wasteland of mud and hoofprints, while the overturned wagon had been completely demolished by the passing cattle. Scattered pieces of wood and torn fabric marked where the family's possessions had been trampled into the earth. The unconscious Sauk woman showed signs of returning awareness, her eyelids fluttering as she slowly regained consciousness. Clara had limited medical supplies in her saddlebags, but she could at least clean the head wound and check for signs of serious injury that might require immediate attention. As the woman gradually awakened, her first concern was clearly for the 3 children who had been trapped beneath the wagon. She spoke rapidly in the Sauk language, her voice rising with maternal anxiety until she confirmed that all 3 triplets had survived the ordeal without serious injury. Clara attempted basic communication through gestures and simple English words, trying to establish the family's circumstances and immediate needs. The woman's elaborate clothing and fine beadwork suggested higher social status than typical among Indians, traveling alone through white-dominated territory. Her obvious education and careful grooming indicated someone accustomed to respect and authority within her own community. "Safe now," Clara repeated, pointing to the children and then to herself. "You safe, children safe." The Sauk woman studied Clara with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess both her character and her motivations. When she finally spoke, her English proved surprisingly fluent, despite a distinctive accent that marked her as a native speaker of Sauk. "You saved my children," she said simply. "Why would you risk your life for strangers?" Clara considered the question, which seemed more profound than its simple words suggested. "Because they needed help," she replied honestly. "Children in danger, it doesn't matter who they belong to." The woman's expression shifted subtly, showing what might have been surprise or respect for Clara's straightforward answer. "I am mourning. Star, daughter of Chief Thunderwalker of the Sauk Nation. These are my children, Swift Arrow, Rising Moon, and Little Wolf." Clara felt her stomach drop as she realized the significance of this revelation. Thunderwalker was known throughout the Illinois Territory as one of the most formidable war chiefs among the Sauk people, a leader who had fought alongside Black Hawk during the recent conflicts with white settlers and military forces. His reputation for strategic brilliance and fierce protection of his people made him both respected and feared by whites who understood frontier politics. "I'm Clara Donovan," she replied, extending her hand in the white gesture of greeting. "I run the trading station near the trail junction." Morning Star accepted the handshake with formal dignity, though her expression suggested she was still processing the implications of Clara's rescue. "The trading station woman," she said thoughtfully. "My husband has spoken of you. He says you deal fairly with all people who come to trade." This reference to previous knowledge created additional complexity for Clara. If Thunderwalker was already aware of her trading station and business practices, then this encounter represented far more than a random meeting between strangers. The Sauk chief would inevitably learn of his family's rescue, and his response to that knowledge remained completely unpredictable. As Clara helped Morning Star and the triplets prepare for the journey to her trading station, she began to understand the broader implications of their encounter. Morningstar's presence in the area wasn't accidental. She had been traveling with trade goods and diplomatic messages between Sauk communities, using the major wagon routes as cover for movements that might otherwise attract unwanted military attention. "We were returning from the great gathering at Rock Island," Morningstar explained as Clara examined the scattered remains of their wagon. "The chiefs met to discuss the new treaties that white officials want us to sign. Much of our trade goods were lost when the wagon overturned." Clara recognized the political significance of this information. Treaty negotiations between federal officials and tribal leaders had become increasingly contentious as white settlement pressure mounted throughout the Illinois Territory. The Sauk people faced impossible choices between accepting restrictive reservation life or continuing resistance that brought increasingly harsh military responses. The destruction of Morningstar's trade goods represented more than personal financial loss. These items likely included diplomatic gifts intended to strengthen alliances between different Sauk communities, as well as valuable furs and crafts that provided economic independence for Thunderwalker's band. Their loss would be seen as a serious blow to the chief's political and economic position. As they gathered what could be salvaged from the wreckage, Clara realized that Morningstar mentioned traveling with her sister's family. The unconscious woman had been part of a larger group, but Clara had only found Morningstar and the Triplets. Where were the others? "Morningstar," Clara asked carefully, "were there more people with you? I want to make sure everyone is accounted." "E4." The Sauk woman's expression darkened with new worry. "My sister Singing Bird travels with her family on the Northern Trail. They plan to meet us at your trading station tonight. They have 2 young sons and a daughter." Clara felt a chill of apprehension as she realized the implications. If Morningstar's sister and her family were also traveling in the area, they might have encountered the Stampede elsewhere along its destructive path. The cattle had covered several miles during their panic flight, potentially threatening other travelers who lacked adequate warning or shelter. "We need to search for them," Clara decided immediately. "If they're out there, they might be hurt or trapped." Morningstar nodded grimly, her maternal instincts clearly extending beyond her own. Children, to include her sister's family? Singing Bird would not know how to survive such danger without help. Her husband, Stone Bear, is a skilled hunter, but he has never faced stampeding cattle. Clara's rescue mission was expanding beyond the immediate crisis to include a broader search operation that would require significant time and resources. The afternoon was already advancing toward evening, and searching the vast prairie for potential stampede victims would be difficult under the best conditions. Thomas appeared on horseback before Clara could organize the expanded search effort. The Irishman's arrival brought both relief and new complications as he reported on the stampede's broader impact across the region. "Clara, thank God you're alive," Thomas called as he approached their small group. "The stampede hit 3 wagon trains on the main trail. We've got injured people at the trading station, and the territorial militia is mobilizing to track down whoever was responsible for losing control of that herd." Clara realized that her rescue of Morningstar and the Triplets had placed her at the center of a much larger crisis involving multiple government jurisdictions and potentially volatile political implications. Military investigations of the stampede would inevitably uncover the presence of prominent Sauk Indians in the area, raising questions about their activities and legal status that could have far-reaching consequences. "Thomas, we need to find Morningstar's sister and her children," Clara explained quickly. "They were traveling separately and might have been caught in the stampede somewhere else along the route." Thomas studied the small group with practical concern. "Clara, we've got responsibilities at the trading station. People are hurt and need medical attention. We can't just abandon them to search the entire prairie for folks who might not even need help." The conflict between immediate obligations and potential humanitarian needs created exactly the kind of moral dilemma that Clara had faced repeatedly during her frontier life. Every choice carried consequences, and there were never enough resources to address all the problems that demanded attention simultaneously. Morningstar resolved the dilemma by taking charge of the search for her sister's family herself. "I will find Singing Bird and her children," she announced with quiet authority. "But first, I must see that my own children reach safety at your trading station." Clara nodded, recognizing the wisdom of this approach. "We'll get your children settled, then organize a proper search party with enough people to cover the area systematically." As they prepared to depart for the trading station, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would prove to be a turning point in her frontier life. Rescuing the children had been a simple act of human decency, but the broader implications of their identity and circumstances threatened to create complications that extended far beyond her immediate ability to manage. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as Clara led Morning Star and the Triplets toward the trading station, where Thomas had reported injured Stampede survivors awaiting assistance. Behind them, scattered pieces of the destroyed wagon marked the site where their lives had intersected through violence and rescue, creating connections that would prove impossible to ignore or forget. Clara Donovan had built her trading station to serve travelers seeking safe passage through the dangerous frontier landscape. She had never anticipated that her own journey would lead her into the complex world of tribal politics, federal treaties, and the increasingly desperate struggle of Native American peoples to maintain their traditional ways of life in the face of overwhelming pressure from white settlement and military force. The Triplets walked beside her horse with the resilient energy of children who had survived disaster and found safety through the kindness of strangers. Their trust in Clara represented a precious gift, but also a responsibility that would demand courage, wisdom, and strength, far beyond anything her previous frontier experience had required. As the trading station came into view across the golden prairie grass, Clara realized that her carefully ordered life was about to become considerably more complicated. Thunderwalker's children were safe, but their father's response to their rescue remained an unknown factor that could transform her from a simple trader into a key figure in the ongoing conflicts that would determine the future of the Illinois territory and all who called it home. The scene that greeted Clara at Donovan's trading station resembled a battlefield more than a frontier business. 7 wagons from 3 different families had sought refuge in her compound, their occupants bearing injuries ranging from broken bones to severe lacerations sustained during their desperate attempts to escape the stampede. The Kellerman family, whose dangerous flight had originally caught Clara's attention, had indeed failed to reach safety and now lay scattered across makeshift beds in her main cabin. Wilhelm Kellerman himself had suffered a crushed leg when his wagon overturned during the final moments of their escape attempt. His wife Martha tended to their youngest daughter, whose arm hung at an unnatural angle, while their 2 sons bore countless bruises and cuts from being thrown from the wagon during its violent crash. The German immigrant's eyes held the hollow look of a man who had gambled everything on reaching Oregon and now faced the possibility of losing it all to medical expenses and equipment replacement. "Mein Gott," Wilhelm whispered as Clara entered. "With Morning Star and the Triplets, we thought we could outrun them. Such foolishness, such terrible foolishness." Clara immediately began assessing the medical situation, while Thomas organized the chaos of multiple families seeking shelter and assistance. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the circuit physician who served the scattered settlements along the wagon routes, had been summoned from his rounds but wouldn't arrive until the following day. Until then, Clara would have to manage with her limited medical knowledge and the basic supplies she maintained for frontier emergencies. Morning Star observed the scene with the keen intelligence that marked her as Thunderwalker's daughter. Despite her own recent trauma, she moved immediately to assist with the injured children, her gentle manner and obvious experience with healing creating instant trust among the frightened families. The Sauk woman's presence represented a bridge between cultures that many frontier settlements never experienced. "I know plants that ease pain," Morning Star offered quietly to Clara as they worked together to splint young Anna Kellerman's broken arm. "My grandmother taught me the old ways of healing. If you trust me to help, I can gather what we need from the prairie." Clara nodded gratefully, recognizing the value of traditional knowledge that complemented her basic frontier medical skills. I trust you completely. These people need all the help we can provide." As they worked together treating the injured, Clara became aware of the suspicious glances directed toward Morning Star by some of the adult survivors. The presence of a well-dressed Sauk woman and 3 Indian children at a trading station filled with injured white settlers created obvious tensions that threatened to complicate an already difficult situation. James Morrison, a Pennsylvania farmer traveling with his extended family toward Oregon, was the first to voice concerns that others were clearly thinking. "Mrs. Donovan, I don't mean to question your judgment, but having Indians around injured white folks seems unwise, especially with all the troubles we've been hearing about between settlers and the tribes." Clara felt Morning Star stiffen beside her as the man's words carried clearly across the crowded cabin. The triplets, who had been helping distribute water to the injured, moved instinctively closer to their mother as they sensed the hostile undercurrents in the room. "Mr. Morrison," Clara replied firmly, "Morning Star and her children are guests in my home who have offered assistance to injured people. I suggest you focus on your own family's recovery rather than questioning those who are trying to help." Morrison's expression suggested he wasn't satisfied with Clara's response, but the immediate needs of his injured wife prevented him from pursuing the confrontation further. However, Clara recognized that the underlying tensions would only worsen as word spread about the Sauk family's presence at her trading station. Clara's hopes for managing the crisis quietly were shattered when Captain Benjamin Crawford arrived, with a patrol of 12 territorial militiamen just as the sun began setting behind the western horizon. Crawford's reputation as a rigid military disciplinarian preceded him throughout the Illinois Territory, and his arrival meant that the Stampede investigation would follow official protocols regardless of humanitarian considerations. The captain's weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene at Donovan's trading station, his calculating gaze taking in the injured settlers, the crowded conditions, and most significantly, the presence of Morning Star and her children among the survivors. Crawford's military bearing and obvious authority created immediate tension among everyone present. "Mrs. Donovan," Crawford announced formally as he dismounted, "I'm investigating the cattle stampede that occurred in this area today. I understand. Your trading station served as a refuge for survivors of the incident." Clara met his gaze steadily, though inwardly she prepared for the complications that military involvement would inevitably bring. "That's correct, Captain. We've provided medical assistance and shelter to injured travelers as circumstances required." Crawford's attention shifted immediately to Morning Star, who was helping Martha Kellerman tend to her injured daughter. The Sauk woman's elaborate beadwork and obviously expensive clothing marked her as someone of high status, rather than a typical frontier Indian seeking charity or employment. "And this woman's status here?" Crawford inquired pointedly. "I wasn't aware that Sauk Indians were involved in the Stampede incident." Clara chose her words carefully, recognizing that Morning Star's safety might depend on how she framed the situation. Morning Star and her children were traveling on the main wagon route when the stampede occurred. They suffered an accident. When their wagon overturned during the chaos, I provided assistance as I would for any travelers in distress. Crawford's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Clara's carefully neutral explanation. "I see. And where exactly did this accident occur? I'll need to examine the site as part of my investigation." Morning Star spoke before Clara could respond, her fluent English surprising the captain, despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. "Captain, our wagon overturned at Willow Creek Crossing when the cattle approached. Mrs. Donovan risked her life to save my children from the wreckage. Without her courage, they would have died." The directness of Morning Star's statement created an uncomfortable silence in the crowded cabin. Crawford's military training had not prepared him for dealing with educated, articulate Indians who spoke as equals rather than submissive tribal members seeking government assistance. "Your children?" Crawford repeated, his tone carrying implications that everyone present understood, and their father's whereabouts. Morning Star's expression remained composed, despite the obvious threat implicit in the captain's question. "My husband hunts with his band in the Northern Territories. I was returning from family visits when this disaster occurred. Clara recognized the careful evasion in Morningstar's response. Thunderwalker's actual location and activities remained deliberately vague, providing no specific information that could be used for military purposes while technically answering the captain's question. Crawford made notes in his official ledger, documenting the presence of prominent Sauk Indians in the area during what was clearly a significant frontier incident. I'll need to interview all survivors individually to establish a complete timeline of events. Mrs. Donovan, I'll require quarters for my men during the investigation. The demand for extended military presence at her trading station represented exactly the complication Clara had hoped to avoid. Crawford's investigation would inevitably uncover inconsistencies in various accounts of the day's events, and his obvious suspicion regarding Morningstar's presence could escalate into something far more dangerous than a routine inquiry. "Captain, I have limited space available," Clara replied diplomatically. "Perhaps your men could establish camp nearby while conducting their investigation." Crawford's cold smile suggested he had anticipated this response. "Mrs. Donovan, territorial. Law requires cooperation with official investigations. I'm sure you understand the importance of ensuring nothing interferes with our inquiry into this incident." As evening deepened, the atmosphere at Donovan's trading station became increasingly strained. Crawford's men established a perimeter around the compound while the captain conducted individual interviews with Stampede survivors. Each interview revealed additional details about the day's events, creating a complex picture that troubled Clara as she listened to various accounts. Several survivors reported seeing unusual activity in the area before the stampede began. Riders had been observed moving parallel to the main wagon routes, staying just beyond clear identification, but close enough to monitor the heavy traffic of westward-bound families. Some witnesses described these riders as possibly being Indian scouts, though others insisted they appeared to be white men engaged in some form of surveillance. Wilhelm Kellerman provided the most disturbing testimony during his interview with Captain Crawford. Despite his injuries, the German immigrant insisted on describing what he had observed during his family's desperate flight from the approaching cattle. "I saw riders deliberately driving the cattle toward the wagon routes," Wilhelm stated emphatically, despite Crawford's obvious skepticism. "These were not cowboys trying to control a stampede. These men were pushing the herd directly into the path of the wagon trains." Crawford's questioning became more intense as he explored the implications of Wilhelm's accusations. "Mr. Kellerman, you're suggesting that the stampede was deliberately directed towards civilian targets. That's a serious allegation requiring substantial evidence." Wilhelm struggled to sit upright despite his crushed leg, his determination to be heard overriding his obvious pain. "Captain, I have worked with cattle in Germany. I know the difference between men trying to stop animals and men driving them forward. What I saw was deliberate." This testimony transformed Crawford's investigation from a routine inquiry into suspected criminal activity with potential military implications. If the stampede had been deliberately weaponized against civilian targets, it represented a form of warfare that demanded serious federal response. Clara felt her stomach tighten as she realized the broader implications of Wilhelm's accusations. Any suggestion that the stampede had been orchestrated as an attack on white settlers would inevitably lead to military retaliation against tribal groups in the area, regardless of their actual involvement in the incident. Morningstar's presence at the trading station would be seen as highly suspicious if investigators concluded that the stampede had been an organized assault on white travelers. Her status as Thunderwalker's wife would make her a valuable source of intelligence about tribal activities and intentions, assuming Crawford could be convinced to view her as a witness rather than a suspect. Late that evening, as Clara helped settle the injured families for the night, Morningstar approached her with information that complicated the situation beyond anything she had imagined. The Sauk woman's expression carried the weight of knowledge that could prove dangerous for everyone involved. "Clara," Morningstar said quietly, ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard by Crawford's guards, "there is something you must know about today's events, something that could bring great danger to all of us if the wrong people learn of it." Clara steeled herself for revelations that would likely force her to make choices between loyalty to her own people and protection of those who had trusted her with their lives. "Tell me what you know." Morningstar glanced toward the triplets, who were sleeping peacefully despite the day's trauma, before continuing in a whisper. The men who drove the cattle toward the wagon trains were not Sauk. They were white men dressed as Indians, trying to make the attack appear to be tribal warfare. The implications of this revelation struck Clara like a physical blow. If Morningstar was correct, the stampede represented not tribal aggression, but a deliberate attempt to frame Native Americans for attacks on white settlers. Such false flag operations could justify massive military campaigns against tribal groups while concealing the true perpetrators' identities and motives. "How can you be certain?" Clara asked, though Morningstar's obvious intelligence and education suggested she was capable of making such distinctions accurately. "I saw them clearly when our wagon overturned," Morningstar replied with quiet conviction. "Their hair was wrong, their movements were wrong, their horses were wrong. These were white men playing at being Indian warriors, but they had not learned to truly become what they pretended to be." Clara understood that Morningstar's testimony could exonerate tribal groups from responsibility for the stampede, while exposing a conspiracy that reached beyond simple criminal activity. However, presenting such evidence would also make Morningstar a target for whoever had orchestrated the false flag operation. "Who else knows what you saw?" Clara inquired, recognizing the deadly implications if the wrong people learned that their deception had been detected by a credible witness. Morningstar's expression grew troubled. "Only you. But if Captain Crawford questions me directly about what I observed, I must choose between lying to protect myself and telling truth that could save my people from punishment for crimes they did not commit." The moral complexity of the situation overwhelmed Clara as she realized that protecting Morningstar might require concealing evidence of a broader conspiracy, while revealing the truth could expose the Sauk woman to lethal retaliation from those responsible for the stampede. "We need time to think this through carefully," Clara decided. "Captain Crawford's investigation is just beginning, and we don't know yet what other evidence he might uncover. Let's see what develops before making any irreversible decisions." Morningstar nodded, though her expression suggested she understood. "That time might not be a luxury they could afford. My husband will come looking for us when we fail to arrive as planned. If he finds soldiers investigating a supposed Indian attack on white settlers, the situation could become very dangerous very quickly." Despite the complications created by Crawford's investigation, Clara remained committed to finding Morningstar's missing sister and her family. Early the following morning, she organized a search party that included Thomas and two reliable men from among the stampede survivors who were uninjured enough to participate in the effort. Captain Crawford initially objected to civilians conducting searches in an area under military investigation, but Clara's argument that missing persons required immediate attention eventually convinced him to authorize the operation. However, he insisted that one of his soldiers accompany the search party to ensure proper documentation of any discoveries. Sergeant William Hayes, a competent non-commissioned officer with extensive frontier experience, proved to be a reasonable compromise between military oversight and practical search requirements. His knowledge of tracking and wilderness survival complemented Clara's intimate familiarity with the local terrain. The search began at dawn, with the party spreading out to cover the northern trail where Singing Bird's family had been traveling when the stampede occurred. Morningstar provided detailed descriptions of her sister's wagon and the clothing worn by her husband, Stone Bear, and their 3 children. "Stone Bear drives a wagon painted with red medicine symbols," Morningstar explained as they prepared to depart. "He is easy to recognize because he walks with a slight limp from an old hunting injury. My sister wears a blue dress with white beadwork that she made for the journey." The search proved more difficult than Clara had anticipated. The stampede's path of destruction extended for several miles, with scattered debris and disturbed ground, making it challenging to identify specific incidents within the broader chaos. Multiple wagon trains had been affected by the disaster, and sorting through the various survival stories required careful attention to details. After 4 hours of systematic searching, Sergeant Hayes discovered evidence that chilled everyone involved. Hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees, approximately 3 miles from Clara's trading station, they found the remains of a wagon that had been burned deliberately rather than destroyed by stampeding cattle. The wagon's construction and decorative elements matched Morningstar's description of her sister's vehicle, but the systematic nature of its destruction suggested something far more sinister than accidental damage. Personal belongings had been scattered and searched, while the wagon itself had been set ablaze to eliminate evidence. This wasn't stampede damage, Sergeant Hayes observed grimly as he examined the burned wreckage. Someone torched this wagon. Deliberately, probably after searching through the contents, Clara's heart raced as she realized the implications. If this was indeed Singing Bird's wagon, then the family's disappearance might be connected to the broader conspiracy that Morningstar had described rather than simple stampede casualties. Thomas discovered additional evidence that confirmed their worst fears. Hidden beneath fallen branches about 50 yards from the burned wagon, he found children's clothing that had been deliberately concealed rather than lost during a chaotic flight from danger. Clara, someone didn't want these items to be found, Thomas reported as he examined the carefully hidden garments. This looks like evidence was being destroyed or concealed. The discovery transformed their search mission into something resembling a criminal investigation. If Singing Bird's family had been targeted specifically, their disappearance might be connected to the false flag operation that Morningstar had witnessed during the stampede. The search parties returned to Donovan's trading station with evidence of Singing Bird's wagon destruction created immediate complications that threatened to spiral beyond Clara's ability to manage. Sergeant Hayes was obligated to report his findings to Captain Crawford, while Clara struggled to protect Morningstar from the dangerous implications of her sister's apparent fate. Crawford's reaction to the burned wagon discovery confirmed Clara's worst fears about the military investigation's direction. Rather than viewing the evidence as proof of criminal activity targeting Native Americans, the captain interpreted it as confirmation that hostile tribal elements were operating in the area with sophisticated organizational capabilities. The systematic destruction of evidence suggests coordinated planning, Crawford announced during his briefing with his subordinates. We may be dealing with tribal groups that have developed more advanced tactical approaches than previous intelligence indicated. Clara watched in horror as Crawford's investigation moved toward conclusions that would justify massive military retaliation against innocent tribal groups while ignoring the actual perpetrators of the conspiracy. The captain's preconceptions about Indian capabilities prevented him from seriously considering that white conspirators might be responsible for the attacks. Morningstar's anguish over her sister's fate was compounded by her recognition that each new development in Crawford's investigation increased the danger facing all Sauk people in the territory. The burned wagon evidence could be used to justify military campaigns that would devastate her people regardless of their actual innocence. They will use my sister's disappearance to attack my husband's band, Morningstar confided to Clara during a private moment. Captain Crawford sees only what confirms his beliefs about Indian warfare. He will not consider that white men might be responsible for these crimes. Clara found herself caught between multiple impossible loyalties as the situation deteriorated. Protecting Morningstar required concealing evidence that might exonerate tribal groups, while revealing the truth about white conspirators could expose the Sauk woman to lethal retaliation from unknown enemies. The arrival of Dr. Harrison provided a temporary distraction from the investigation's complications, as the circuit physician immediately took charge of treating the more seriously injured stampede survivors. His medical expertise relieved Clara of responsibilities that had been stretching her capabilities, but it also meant additional witnesses to the unusual circumstances at her trading station. Dr. Harrison's examination of Wilhelm Kellerman's injuries revealed complications that would require extended treatment, effectively stranding the German family at the trading station for several weeks. Similar medical necessities applied to other injured families, creating a semi-permanent refugee camp. that would be difficult to conceal from broader territorial attention. Late in the afternoon of the second day, Thomas spotted movement on the distant horizon that sent a chill through everyone who understood its implications. A line of mounted figures had appeared on the ridge overlooking the trading station, maintaining perfect stillness as they observed the activity below. Even at extreme distance, the riders' positioning and behavior marked them as Sauk warriors conducting reconnaissance rather than casual travelers. Their disciplined formation and strategic vantage point suggested professional military assessment of the situation at Donovan's trading station. Captain Crawford immediately ordered defensive preparations, assuming the mounted figures represented a hostile force preparing to attack the injured settlers and military personnel. His soldiers took positions behind improvised fortifications, while Crawford used his telescope to study the distant warriors. Approximately 20 mounted hostiles maintaining observation positions, Crawford reported to his men. They appear to be conducting tactical assessment prior to possible assault on our position. Clara recognized that Crawford's military response to Thunderwalker's scouts was precisely the kind of escalation that could transform a tense situation into open warfare. If the Sauk warriors interpreted defensive preparations as hostile intent, they might attack to protect themselves from perceived threats. Morningstar's reaction to the distant figures confirmed Clara's fears about the developing confrontation. The Sauk woman's expression showed both relief at evidence that her husband was searching for his family and terror at the possibility that his arrival might trigger the very conflict that could destroy everything she sought to protect. "My husband, in comes for his children," Morningstar whispered to Clara as they watched Crawford's soldiers prepare for battle. "But if the soldiers attack his warriors, there will be war that cannot be stopped." Clara realized that she stood at the fulcrum of events that could determine whether the Illinois Territory experienced peace or devastating warfare. Thunderwalker's arrival seeking his family could either provide an opportunity for communication and understanding, or it could trigger the military confrontation that would validate every prejudice about Indian aggression while concealing the true conspiracy behind recent attacks. The mounted figures remained motionless on the ridge as afternoon shadows began lengthening toward evening. Their patient observation suggested that Thunderwalker was assessing the situation carefully before deciding on his course of action. But Clara understood that military patience had distinct limits that could be exceeded without warning. As darkness approached, Clara faced the most critical decision of her frontier life. She could maintain neutrality and hope that others would find peaceful solutions to the mounting crisis. Or she could take active steps to facilitate communication between Thunderwalker and the military forces that viewed his presence as an immediate threat. The triplets played quietly near their mother, unaware that their father's love for them had brought him to the edge of a confrontation that could determine the fate of two peoples struggling to coexist in an increasingly crowded and dangerous frontier landscape. Darkness fell over Donovan's trading station like a suffocating blanket, heavy with the weight of impending violence that everyone could feel but no one dared acknowledge openly. Captain Crawford had positioned his 12 soldiers in defensive formations around the compound, their nervous energy crackling through the night air as they maintained vigilant watch on the ridge where Thunderwalker's scouts had disappeared. With the setting sun, Clara moved through the crowded cabin where injured settlers tried to find restless sleep, despite the tension that made every shadow seem threatening and every sound potentially hostile. The Kellerman children whimpered in their sleep, their young minds processing trauma that would mark them for years to come, while their parents lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering if they would survive to see Oregon. Dr. Harrison worked by lamplight, changing bandages and administering what pain relief his limited supplies could provide. The elderly physician's presence brought some comfort to the frightened families, but even his steady competence couldn't entirely dispel the atmosphere of barely controlled panic that pervaded the trading station. Morningstar sat beside her, sleeping triplets, her dark eyes reflecting firelight as she maintained the maternal vigil that transcended cultural boundaries. Clara observed the Sauk woman's composed exterior and recognized the internal struggle between hope for her family's safety and terror at the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. "They won't attack tonight," Morningstar said quietly. When Clara approached with coffee and hardtack, "My husband is not a fool. He knows the soldiers are ready for him, and Thunderwalker never fights when his enemies expect battle." Clara accepted this assessment while wondering what strategic alternatives the Sauk chief might be considering. What will he do instead? His children are here, and he must know that Captain Crawford won't simply allow him to take them and leave. Morningstar's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the complex calculations that would guide her husband's decisions. Thunderwalker understands white men better than they understand themselves. He knows that soldiers think like soldiers, always preparing for the fight they expect, rather than the one they face. The cryptic nature of Morningstar's response troubled Clara, though she recognized that the Sauk woman was unlikely to reveal specific details about her husband's tactical planning. The cultural loyalty that bound Morningstar to her people remained stronger than her gratitude to Clara, despite the life-saving rescue that had brought them together. Sergeant Hayes approached Clara's position near the cabin entrance, his experienced demeanor suggesting he had information that wouldn't wait until morning. The non-commissioned officer's frontier service had taught him to read signs that less experienced soldiers might miss, and his expression indicated something significant. Had captured his attention. "Mrs. Donovan, might I have a word?" Hayes inquired with the respectful formality that marked him as a career soldier who understood the importance of maintaining civilian cooperation during difficult operations. Clara followed the sergeant to a position where their conversation couldn't be overheard by either the frightened settlers or Morningstar's acute attention. Hayes's weathered face showed the concern of a man who had seen enough frontier warfare to recognize when situations were developing beyond standard military protocols. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about that burned wagon we found today," Hayes began carefully. "The destruction pattern doesn't match anything I've seen in previous Indian raids. It looks more like the work of someone trying to eliminate evidence rather than send a message." Clara's pulse quickened as she realized that Hayes might be reaching conclusions similar to Morningstar's observations about white men disguised as Indians. "What exactly did you notice that seemed unusual, Sergeant?" Hayes glanced toward Captain Crawford's position before continuing in a lowered voice. "The personal belongings were searched systematically before the wagon was burned. That's not typical Indian behavior during raids. They take what they want and move on quickly. They don't usually conduct detailed searches looking for specific items." The sergeant's analysis confirmed Clara's growing suspicions about the broader conspiracy while creating new opportunities for revealing the truth about the Stampede's origins. If Hayes could be convinced to present his observations to Captain Crawford, it might provide the military perspective necessary to redirect the investigation toward the actual perpetrators. "Have you shared these observations with Captain Crawford?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer based on Hayes's cautious approach to their conversation. Hayes shook his head grimly. "Captain's convinced we're dealing with sophisticated Indian warfare. He's not interested in theories that might complicate his tactical assessment. But, ma'am, I've fought Indians for 15 years, and this doesn't feel right." Clara recognized that Sergeant Hayes represented a potential ally in preventing the military escalation that threatened to engulf innocent people in warfare based on false premises. The sergeant's credibility with his commanding officer might provide the leverage necessary to introduce alternative interpretations of the available evidence. First light brought unexpected developments that transformed the standoff from passive observation to active crisis. Thomas discovered fresh horse tracks leading directly to the trading station's water well, evidence that someone had approached during the night despite the military perimeter that should have prevented any unauthorized access to the compound. More disturbing was the discovery of a carefully crafted message left beside the well, written in English on birch bark, using traditional Sauk pictographs as decorative elements. The combination of languages and symbols suggested sophistication that challenged typical assumptions about Indian communication capabilities. Captain Crawford examined the message with obvious suspicion, his military training interpreting the successful penetration of his defensive perimeter as evidence of hostile reconnaissance rather than potential diplomatic communication. The captain's rigid adherence to standard procedures prevented him from considering that the message might represent an attempt at peaceful contact. "Mrs. Donovan," Crawford announced formally, "this message is addressed to you specifically. I'll need you to read it aloud so that military personnel can assess its contents for intelligence value." Clara accepted the birchbark document with trembling hands, recognizing that its contents would likely determine whether the developing crisis escalated into open warfare or found resolution through dialogue. The careful script and formal language suggested that Thunderwalker himself had composed the message, employing his mission school education to communicate directly with the woman who had saved his children. "To the white woman who saved the children of Thunderwalker," Clara read aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "I am Thunderwalker, war chief of the Sauk people, son of the great Chief Blackhawk who fought for our homeland. You have shown courage and honor by protecting my family when they faced death. This creates debt between us that must be acknowledged according to the customs of both our peoples." Crawford's expression darkened as he processed the implications of direct communication from one of the most feared war chiefs in the Illinois Territory. The message confirmed that the mounted observers represented Thunderwalker's personal force rather than random tribal raiders, significantly escalating the potential consequences of any military confrontation. Clara continued reading despite the obvious tension her words created among the listening soldiers and settlers. "I know that white soldiers surround your trading station, preparing for war, because they believe my people attacked their wagon trains. This belief is false. The evil that struck your travelers came from white men, wearing Indian paint to hide their true faces. The revelation that Thunderwalker knew about the false flag operation sent shocked murmurs through the assembled listeners. Captain Crawford's face flushed with anger as he realized that his investigation's fundamental assumptions were being challenged by someone with access to information that contradicted official military intelligence. "Continue reading, Mrs. Donovan," Crawford ordered coldly, though his hand had moved instinctively toward his sidearm as the message's implications became clear. Clara took a deep breath before delivering the message's most critical section. "I offer to meet with the soldier chief and the woman who saved my children. We will speak of truth about the evil men who kill white families while wearing Sauk paint. But this meeting must be in the open prairie where no tricks can be hidden by either side. If the soldier chief agrees, I will come at midday with only 2 warriors. If he refuses, I will take my family and leave this place, but the evil men will continue their killing." The formal challenge placed Captain Crawford in an impossible position that exposed the limitations of standard military approaches to frontier conflicts. Accepting Thunderwalker's proposal would require acknowledging the war chief as a legitimate negotiating partner, while rejecting it would eliminate any possibility of learning the truth about the conspiracy behind recent attacks. Morning Stars. Reaction to her husband's message provided additional complexity to Crawford's decision. The Sauk woman's obvious relief at evidence that Thunderwalker sought peaceful resolution was tempered by her recognition that military prejudices might prevent the dialogue necessary to expose the actual perpetrators of the false flag operation. "Captain Crawford," Morningstar said with quiet dignity, "my husband does not offer to meet with enemies. He offers to share knowledge that could save many lives, both white and Indian. This is not weakness, but wisdom." Crawford's military training had not prepared him for dealing with articulate Native Americans who challenged his authority through reasoned argument rather than violent resistance. The captain's obvious discomfort with Morningstar's direct address reflected broader cultural assumptions that complicated frontier diplomacy. While Captain Crawford wrestled with Thunderwalker's diplomatic challenge, Clara and Sergeant Hayes discovered additional evidence that confirmed the existence of a sophisticated conspiracy targeting both white settlers and tribal groups throughout the Illinois Territory. Their investigation of the burned wagon site had revealed details that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated deception. Hidden beneath fallen leaves near the destroyed wagon, Hayes found fragments of white clothing that had been partially burned but not completely destroyed. The fabric quality and construction indicated garments worn by well-dressed white men rather than the typical frontier clothing that most settlers could afford. More significant was the discovery of a metal button bearing the insignia of the Chicago Commercial Association, an organization representing business interests that viewed continued Indian presence as an obstacle to territorial development. The button's location, amid evidence of the false flag operation, suggested connections between the attacks and powerful economic interests seeking to justify military removal of tribal groups. "Mrs. Donovan, this changes everything," Hayes explained, as he showed Clara the incriminating evidence. "If business interests are orchestrating attacks to justify Indian removal, we're dealing with conspiracy that reaches far beyond simple criminal activity." Clara understood that the evidence Hayes had discovered could exonerate tribal groups while exposing corruption that might reach the highest levels of territorial government. However, presenting such accusations would require careful handling. To avoid retaliation from powerful interests that had already demonstrated willingness to murder innocent people to achieve their objectives. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their investigation as a delegation of 3 riders appeared on the horizon, moving at a measured pace that suggested formal diplomatic contact rather than hostile approach. Even at distance, the riders' bearing and formation marked them as representatives of Thunderwalker, responding to the morning's message exchange. Captain Crawford immediately ordered his men to battle stations, interpreting the approaching delegation as confirmation of the hostile intent he had expected from the beginning. The captain's automatic assumption that any Indian approach represented an attack reflected the military mindset that viewed all tribal contact through the lens of potential warfare. "Hold your fire unless directly threatened," Crawford commanded. His soldiers, while drawing his own sidearm in preparation for what he anticipated would be a violent confrontation. The captain's military experience in previous frontier conflicts had not included diplomatic encounters with educated tribal leaders seeking peaceful resolution of complex disputes. Clara recognized that Crawford's defensive preparations could easily trigger the warfare that Thunderwalker's message had sought to prevent. The captain's inability to distinguish between diplomatic approach and military assault threatened to destroy any possibility of peaceful resolution while confirming tribal suspicions about white intentions. "Captain Crawford," Clara called urgently. Thunderwalker's message specifically proposed peaceful meeting. Those riders are probably his diplomatic representatives, not an attacking force. Crawford's response revealed the depth of his prejudices about Indian capabilities and intentions. "Mrs. Donovan, Indians don't conduct diplomacy. They conduct raids. Any approach by hostile forces will be met with appropriate military response." The 3 approaching riders maintained perfect formation as they advanced across the prairie, their dignified bearing and obvious restraint demonstrating the discipline that marked Thunderwalker's band as a formidable military organization. The lead rider carried a staff adorned with white feathers, traditional symbols of peaceful intent that would be recognized by anyone familiar with tribal customs. As the delegation drew closer, Clara could see that the riders were mature warriors, whose scars and bearing marked them as veterans of numerous conflicts. Their presence as diplomatic representatives, rather than young fighters seeking glory, suggested that Thunderwalker was approaching the situation with careful consideration rather than impulsive aggression. The lead envoy, a grey-haired warrior, with intricate facial tattoos that marked his status as a senior war leader, called out in fluent English when the delegation reached speaking distance of the trading station's defensive perimeter. His formal manner and educated speech patterns reflected the same mission school background that had shaped Thunderwalker's communication style. "I am Grey Eagle, war leader of the Sauk people, speaking for Thunderwalker. son of Black Hawk, the envoy announced with ceremonial gravity. I come under the white feathers of peace to speak with the soldier chief and the woman who saved our children. Captain Crawford's response demonstrated his complete inability to recognize diplomatic protocol when presented by Native Americans. State your business and withdraw immediately. This area is under military jurisdiction, and hostile Indians are not permitted. Grey Eagle's expression remained composed, despite Crawford's obvious hostility, though Clara detected subtle signs of the warrior's growing impatience with the captain's dismissive attitude. The envoy's restraint in the face of direct insults suggested either remarkable personal discipline or specific instructions from Thunderwalker about maintaining peaceful contact despite provocations. Soldier Chief, I bring words from Thunderwalker about the evil that has been done in our name, Grey Eagle continued with formal dignity. White men have painted their faces as Sauk warriors and attacked your people to make war between us. Thunderwalker offers to share knowledge that will expose these deceivers. Crawford's military mind interpreted Grey Eagle's diplomatic language as confirmation of hostile intent rather than recognition of the conspiracy that Hayes and Clara had discovered through physical evidence. The captain's preconceptions about Indian deception prevented him from considering that tribal leaders might be offering genuine assistance in exposing white criminals. I don't negotiate with hostiles, Crawford declared flatly. If your chief has information relevant to military investigation, he can provide it through proper territorial authorities. Grey Eagle's reaction to Crawford's refusal revealed the diplomatic sophistication that characterized Thunderwalker's approach to frontier politics. Rather than responding with anger or threats, the senior warrior simply nodded acknowledgement of Crawford's position before delivering a message that transformed the entire situation. Soldier Chief refuses wisdom offered in peace, Grey Eagle announced formally. Thunderwalker understands, but the woman who saved our children has earned the right to hear truth, whether Soldier Chief wishes to listen or not. Grey Eagle's words placed Clara at the center of a diplomatic crisis that would determine whether the Illinois Territory experienced peace or devastating warfare. Thunderwalker was offering to share crucial information about the conspiracy behind recent attacks, but only through direct communication with the woman who had demonstrated courage and honor by saving his children. Captain Crawford's immediate response revealed his recognition that accepting Thunderwalker's terms would undermine military authority, while rejecting them would eliminate any possibility of learning the truth about the conspiracy. The captain's rigid adherence to proper channels conflicted directly with the practical necessities of frontier diplomacy. Mrs. Donovan, Crawford stated coldly, you will not engage in unauthorized communication with hostile Indians. Any information they possess can be provided through official military channels or not at all. Clara understood that Crawford's position eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution while ensuring that the conspiracy would remain hidden behind military investigations that focused exclusively on tribal suspects. The captain's inability to consider alternative explanations for recent attacks guaranteed that the actual perpetrators would escape justice while innocent people suffered retaliation. Morningstar's quiet voice carried clearly across the tense confrontation as she addressed Crawford with the dignity that marked her as Thunderwalker's wife and the daughter of a chief. Captain, my husband offers to give you the white men who killed your people. Why do you refuse this gift? Crawford's face flushed with anger at Morningstar's direct challenge to his authority and judgment. Because Indians are liars who cannot be trusted. Any information they provide is designed to serve their own purposes rather than reveal truth. The casual racism of Crawford's response struck Clara like a physical blow as she realized that the captain's prejudices made peaceful resolution impossible regardless of evidence or logic. Crawford's assumption that all Native Americans were inherently deceptive eliminated any possibility of considering that they might be victims rather than perpetrators of the recent attacks. Grey Eagle's reaction to Crawford's insults demonstrated the remarkable restraint that Thunderwalker had imposed on his warriors despite extreme provocation. Rather than responding with violence that would justify military retaliation, the senior war leader simply turned his attention to Clara with formal courtesy. "Woman who saved our children," Grey Eagle said with ceremonial gravity, "Thunderwalker offers you choice. Come to the meeting place at midday and learn truth about the evil that threatens all our peoples, or remain with soldiers who prefer comfortable lies to dangerous truth." Clara's response would determine not only her own fate, but the future relationship between white settlers and tribal groups throughout the region. Accepting Thunderwalker's invitation would require defying military authority while potentially exposing herself to deadly retaliation from the conspiracy's unknown members. Refusing would guarantee that the truth remained hidden while innocent people died in escalating warfare. As Clara struggled with her impossible choice, Dr. Harrison provided unexpected support that shifted the moral balance of the situation. The elderly physician had been listening to the exchange with growing concern about the humanitarian implications of Crawford's inflexible position. "Captain Crawford," Dr. Harrison interjected with the authority that came from decades of respected frontier service, "if these people have information about attacks on civilians, don't we have an obligation to investigate regardless of the source?" Crawford's irritation at being challenged by civilian authorities was evident in his sharp response. "Doctor, military matters are not subject to medical opinion. The security of this territory requires adherence to proper protocols." Dr. Harrison's expression hardened as he realized that Crawford's rigid thinking threatened to perpetuate violence that could have been prevented through dialogue. "Captain, proper protocol includes protecting civilian lives through all available means. If Native Americans have knowledge that could prevent further attacks, ignoring that knowledge makes us complicit in future casualties." The doctor's moral argument resonated with several of the injured settlers who had been listening to the confrontation with growing understanding of its implications. Wilhelm Kellerman, despite his injuries, struggled to speak from his position near the cabin entrance. "Captain, these Indians are offering to help us find the men who tried to kill our families," Wilhelm said with determination that overcame his obvious pain. Why would we refuse such help? Crawford's position became increasingly isolated as civilian voices began supporting dialogue with Thunderwalker's representatives. The captain's military authority could not overcome the practical wisdom of people who understood that their survival might depend on learning the truth about their attackers. Clara realized that the moment had arrived for her to choose between military orders and moral obligation. Thunderwalker's offer represented the only opportunity to expose the conspiracy, while preventing the warfare that would devastate both white and Native American communities throughout the territory. "Grey Eagle," Clara announced clearly, ensuring that everyone present could hear her decision. "Please tell Thunderwalker that I will meet with him at midday to learn the truth about these attacks." Crawford's face contorted with rage as he realized that his authority was being directly challenged by a civilian woman whose moral courage exceeded his own. "Mrs. Donovan, you are forbidden to leave this compound. Any attempt to meet with hostile Indians will be prevented by force." Clara met Crawford's furious gaze with calm determination. "Captain, this is my property and my choice. You have no legal authority to detain civilians who have committed no crimes." The confrontation between civilian rights and military authority created a crisis that would test the fundamental principles governing frontier society. Crawford's attempt to prevent Clara's meeting with Thunderwalker could establish precedents that undermined civilian governance while potentially triggering the very warfare his actions were supposed to prevent. Grey Eagle observed the conflict with obvious satisfaction at Clara's courage while maintaining the diplomatic restraint that characterized Thunderwalker's approach to frontier politics. "Woman who saved our children shows the courage that earned our respect. Thunderwalker will be honored to share truth with one who values justice above safety." As midday approached, Clara prepared for the most dangerous and important meeting of her frontier life. Thunderwalker's choice of location for their encounter demonstrated his understanding of the delicate balance between diplomatic necessity and personal security that governed such unprecedented communication. The meeting place lay in an open meadow approximately 1 mile from the trading station, providing clear sight lines that would prevent either side from concealing additional forces while offering enough distance to minimize the risk of misunderstandings escalating into violence. Thunderwalker's selection of terrain reflected the tactical sophistication that had made him one of the most respected war chiefs among the Sauk people. Morningstar approached Clara as she prepared to depart, carrying a small leather pouch decorated with traditional beadwork that identified it as having ceremonial significance. The Sauk woman's expression combined gratitude for Clara's courage with concern about the dangers inherent in direct communication with her husband. "Clara, my husband has instructed me to give you this," Morningstar said as she handed over the ceremonial pouch. "It contains medicine that will protect you during the meeting, but more importantly, it marks you as someone under Thunderwalker's protection." Clara accepted the pouch with recognition of its significance as both practical protection and symbolic statement of tribal acceptance. Thunderwalker's gesture demonstrated his understanding that Clara's safety might depend on clear identification. As someone who enjoyed his personal guarantee of security, Captain Crawford made one final attempt to prevent Clara's departure, positioning 2 soldiers at the compound's entrance with orders to detain any civilians attempting unauthorized contact with hostile Indians. The captain's action represented a direct challenge to civilian authority that would have lasting implications for frontier governance. "Sergeant Hayes," Crawford ordered formally, "prevent Mrs. Donovan from leaving this compound. Use whatever force is necessary to maintain military security." Hayes's response revealed the internal conflict that Crawford's orders created within the military unit itself. The sergeant's frontier experience had taught him to distinguish between tactical necessity and counterproductive rigidity, and his expression showed reluctance to follow orders that might precipitate rather than prevent violence. "Captain, Mrs. Donovan is a civilian on her own property," Hayes replied carefully. "Military authority to detain civilians requires specific legal justification that I am not certain exists in this situation." Crawford's fury at being challenged by his own subordinate reflected his recognition that his authority was crumbling in the face of practical wisdom and moral courage demonstrated by both civilians and military personnel. The captain's isolation revealed the fundamental weakness of leadership based on rigid adherence to procedures rather than adaptive response to complex situations. Clara resolved the confrontation by walking directly toward the compound's entrance, forcing Hayes to choose between physical restraint of a civilian woman and defiance of his commanding officer's orders. The sergeant's decision would determine whether military authority or civilian rights would prevail in determining frontier society's response to the developing crisis. Sergeant Hayes stepped aside as Clara approached, his action representing a choice between competing loyalties that would have far-reaching implications for military-civilian relations throughout the territory. "Ma'am, I believe you have the right to make your own decisions about your safety and your property." The prairie meadow stretched before Clara like nature's own amphitheater, its golden grass swaying in the autumn breeze that carried the scent of approaching winter. The meeting place Thunderwalker had chosen possessed an almost mystical quality, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches seemed to witness countless generations of human struggle and reconciliation. Clara walked alone across the open ground, her footsteps muffled by the thick grass, while her heart hammered against her ribs with each step toward the unknown. Behind her, she could feel Captain Crawford's telescopes tracking her movement, while ahead lay the most feared war chief in the Illinois Territory, a man whose reputation for both wisdom and ruthless warfare had become legendary among white settlers. Thunderwalker materialized from behind the largest oak tree with the fluid grace of a predator, his tall frame draped in traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that marked his status as both warrior and chief. His face bore the weathered dignity of a man who had led his people through impossible choices, while his dark eyes held intelligence that immediately dispelled any assumptions about primitive thinking. Two warriors flanked Thunderwalker at respectful distances, their positioning providing security while demonstrating the chief's confidence in his own safety. The careful choreography of their arrangement spoke to military discipline that rivaled anything Captain Crawford could field. Yet their relaxed postures suggested genuine peaceful intent rather than barely restrained aggression. Woman who saved. "My children," Thunderwalker greeted Clara in English that carried only a slight accent, his voice resonating with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You have shown courage by coming here, despite the soldier, chief's anger. This honors both my family and your own spirit." Clara found herself face to face with a man whose physical presence commanded immediate respect. Thunderwalker stood nearly 6 feet tall, his muscular frame bearing scars that told stories of countless battles, while his bearing radiated the confidence of someone who had never encountered a challenge he couldn't overcome through strength, cunning, or wisdom. "Chief Thunderwalker," Clara replied, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the magnitude of the moment. "Your children are safe and recovering well. They showed remarkable courage during the stampede, just as their father shows wisdom by seeking peace rather than war." Thunderwalker's expression softened slightly at mention of his children, revealing the paternal love that had driven him to risk everything by approaching a military position to ensure their safety. "Morning Star has told me how you threw yourself between my family and the stampeding cattle. Such courage creates bonds that cannot be broken by the fears of lesser men." The chief gestured toward a fallen log that would serve as seating for their unprecedented conference. "We have much to discuss, and little time before the soldier chief's patience ends. What I tell you today could save many lives, both white and Sauk, but only if you have the strength to act on dangerous knowledge." Thunderwalker's revelation began with careful deliberation, his words chosen to convey maximum information while avoiding details that might compromise ongoing Sauk intelligence operations. The chief's sophisticated understanding of frontier politics became evident as he outlined a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple criminal activity. "3 moons ago, my scouts reported strange activities near the Chicago settlements," Thunderwalker explained, his gaze never leaving Clara's face as he assessed her ability to comprehend the implications of his intelligence. "White men were meeting with traders who deal in human misery, planning something that would bring great profit from Indian blood." Clara listened intently as Thunderwalker described a network of corrupt businessmen, territorial officials, and criminal elements who had developed a systematic approach to eliminating Native American land rights through manufactured conflicts. The conspiracy's sophistication exceeded anything she had imagined, involving coordination between multiple territories and federal corruption that reached Washington itself. These evil men have learned that direct warfare against Indians brings questions from Eastern newspapers and government officials who still remember their Christian teachings, Thunderwalker continued with bitter accuracy. "But if Indians appear to attack innocent white families, then military response becomes not only acceptable, but demanded by righteous anger." The false flag operations Thunderwalker described represented a calculated strategy for eliminating tribal resistance to territorial expansion while enriching conspirators through land speculation and military contracts. Each manufactured incident created justification for seizing additional tribal territories, while directing profitable military campaigns against communities that posed no actual threat to white settlements. The men who drove cattle into your wagon trains wore paint and feathers, but their horses carried Chicago brands and their boots were made in Eastern factories, Thunderwalker revealed, with the precision of someone who had observed the operation firsthand. "My warriors followed them back to a camp where white men shed their Indian disguises and counted money paid for creating war." Clara felt her blood chill as she realized the scope of the deception that had nearly triggered devastating warfare between innocent peoples. The conspiracy's success depended on maintaining the illusion that tribal groups posed immediate threats to white settlers, justifying military responses that served private profit rather than public safety. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked, recognizing that Thunderwalker's revelation placed both of them in mortal danger from enemies with resources to eliminate anyone who threatened their profitable operations. Thunderwalker's expression grew grave as he considered the personal costs of exposing the conspiracy. "Because my people will die, whether we fight the soldiers or not. If we resist, they call us hostile and attack with many guns. If we accept their reservation boundaries, we starve slowly while they steal what little land remains. Only truth can save us now." Thunderwalker produced a leather satchel that contained evidence his warriors had gathered during their surveillance of the conspiracy's operations. The documents within painted a horrifying picture of systematic deception designed to eliminate tribal resistance while enriching corrupt officials through land seizures and military contracts. Letters between Chicago business leaders discussed specific plans for triggering Indian wars through false flag operations, with detailed cost analyses showing projected profits from territorial acquisitions and military supply contracts. The correspondence revealed corruption that reached federal territorial administration, involving officials Clara had assumed were working to maintain peace rather than orchestrate profitable warfare. "This letter is signed by Territorial Governor James Madison Porter himself," Thunderwalker explained, as he showed Clara handwritten instructions for coordinating false flag operations with military responses. "He promises investors that Indian resistance will be eliminated within 2 years through systematic provocation and retaliation." Clara studied the damning evidence with growing horror at the scope of the betrayal it represented. Governor Porter's personal involvement in the conspiracy meant that appeals to territorial authority would only alert the perpetrators while eliminating any possibility of legitimate governmental response to their crimes. Maps included in the satchel showed planned locations for future false flag operations, with specific targeting of communities that possessed valuable mineral resources or strategic transportation advantages. The systematic nature of the planning revealed a long-term strategy for eliminating all tribal presence in the Illinois Territory through manufactured justifications for military action. "How did your warriors obtain these documents?" Clara asked, recognizing that the evidence's acquisition might have required actions that could justify retaliation against Thunderwalker's band. Thunderwalker's expression showed grim satisfaction at his intelligence operation's success. "White men who dress as Indians to kill innocent families do not guard their secrets well when they believe no real Indians are watching. My warriors have learned much about moving unseen through country where all eyes look for war paint and feathers." The chief's revelation of ongoing Sauk intelligence operations demonstrated capabilities that contradicted every assumption Captain Crawford and other military leaders made about tribal organization and sophistication. Thunderwalker's warriors had been conducting systematic surveillance of the conspiracy while remaining completely undetected by either the perpetrators or official military forces. Thunderwalker's evidence placed Clara at the center of a moral crisis that would test everything she believed about justice, loyalty, and survival in frontier society. Possessing proof of the conspiracy obligated her to expose crimes that threatened innocent people, yet doing so would make her a target for elimination by enemies with unlimited resources and official protection. "What do you expect me to do with this information?" Clara asked, though she already understood that Thunderwalker's revelation carried implicit demands for action that would require courage far beyond anything her previous frontier experience had demanded. Thunderwalker's response revealed the desperate calculations that had driven his unprecedented approach to a white woman for assistance. "Soldiers will not believe Sauk words about white man's crimes, but they might listen to the woman who saved our children, especially if she carries proof that cannot be denied." The chief's strategy placed Clara in the impossible position of convincing Captain Crawford and other military officials to investigate their own superiors for treason and conspiracy. The evidence Thunderwalker provided could exonerate tribal groups while exposing corruption, but presenting it would require confronting entrenched interests with power to destroy anyone who threatened their profitable operations. Captain Crawford already believes you're planning attacks on white settlements, Clara pointed out, recognizing the fundamental obstacle to any peaceful resolution of the crisis. Showing him evidence of white conspiracies will only convince him that it's sophisticated Indian deception. Thunderwalker nodded acknowledgement of the challenge, while maintaining his conviction that truth offered the only path to survival for both peoples. Then we must find another way to speak truth that soldiers cannot ignore. The evil men have planned their next attack for 3 days hence, targeting the Morrison family settlement on Raccoon Creek. The revelation that another false flag operation was imminent transformed Clara's moral dilemma into an urgent crisis, requiring immediate action. Knowledge of the planned attack obligated her to prevent it, yet warning potential victims would alert the conspirators while possibly triggering the very warfare the operation was designed to justify. How can you be certain about their plans? Clara asked, needing verification before committing to actions that could have devastating consequences for everyone involved. Thunderwalker's explanation revealed the sophisticated intelligence network his warriors had developed through careful observation of the conspiracy's operations. My men watched the evil camp from hidden positions. They heard white leaders discussing timing and targets while counting money paid for previous attacks. The Morrison family was chosen because their land contains iron ore that Chicago men wish to claim. Thunderwalker's proposal for preventing the planned attack required cooperation between Sauk warriors and white civilians in a joint operation that would expose the conspiracy while protecting innocent lives. The unprecedented alliance he suggested challenged every assumption about frontier relationships while offering the only realistic chance for stopping the immediate threat. My warriors can capture the false Indians before they reach the Morrison settlement, Thunderwalker explained, outlining a strategy that would require careful coordination and perfect timing. But we need white witnesses who cannot be dismissed as Sauk lies when soldiers arrive to investigate. Clara understood that Thunderwalker was proposing she accompany Sauk warriors on a mission to intercept the false flag operation in progress. Such participation would provide the credible testimony necessary to expose the conspiracy while placing her in mortal danger from enemies who had already demonstrated willingness to murder anyone who threatened their interests. You're asking me to trust my life to warriors that Captain Crawford considers hostile enemies, Clara observed, recognizing the personal risks inherent in Thunderwalker's proposal while acknowledging its logic as the only viable solution to their shared crisis. Thunderwalker's response carried the weight of personal honor that governed traditional warrior culture. Woman who saved my children has earned place among my family that no danger can change. My warriors will protect you with same courage you showed when cattle threatened my little ones. The chief's guarantee of protection carried significance that transcended simple military alliance, representing adoption into kinship relationships that created obligations stronger than tribal loyalty. Thunderwalker was offering Clara a form of security that would survive any political changes, while binding her to responsibilities that extended far beyond preventing a single attack. If we succeed in exposing these men, what happens to your people afterward? Clara asked, recognizing that victory over the immediate conspiracy might still leave fundamental conflicts between white expansion and tribal survival. Thunderwalker's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the long-term implications of success or failure in their desperate alliance. If truth is revealed and evil men punished, perhaps my people can find peace through honest treaties with honorable white leaders. If we fail, there will be war that ends only when one people destroys the other completely. Clara's decision carried implications that extended far beyond her personal survival to encompass the fate of two civilizations struggling to coexist in an increasingly crowded and dangerous frontier landscape. Thunderwalker's alliance offered the possibility of justice and peace, but accepting it required abandoning the safety of neutrality for the perilous path of active resistance to corruption. When would this operation take place? Clara asked, her question representing acceptance of Thunderwalker's proposal, despite the enormous risks it entailed for everyone involved. Thunderwalker's satisfaction at her decision was evident in his slight smile as he outlined the timing necessary for intercepting the false flag operation before it could reach its intended targets. Tomorrow at dawn, my warriors will move to positions overlooking the evil men's camp. When they begin their journey toward Morrison settlement, we will be ready. The plan required Clara to leave her trading station again, abandoning the injured settlers and defying Captain Crawford's direct orders, while placing herself under the protection of warriors the military considered hostile enemies. Success would expose the conspiracy and prevent warfare, but failure would likely result in her death and the complete destruction of Thunderwalker's band. I'll need to bring Sergeant Hayes, Clara decided, recognizing that military testimony would be essential for validating whatever evidence they obtained during the operation. He's already suspicious about the burned wagon incident, and his word carries weight with other soldiers. Thunderwalker considered this addition to their alliance with the strategic thinking that had made him one of the most successful war chiefs among the Sauk people. Can this soldier be trusted to see truth, even when it contradicts his training about Indian warfare? Clara's assessment of Hayes's character provided the foundation for expanding their desperate alliance to include military personnel who possessed both competence and integrity. Sergeant Hayes has enough frontier experience to recognize genuine Indian behavior from white men pretending to be Indians. If we can show him the deception in progress, he'll report it accurately, regardless of political consequences. Dawn broke gray and cold across the Illinois prairie as Clara made her final preparations for the most dangerous mission of her life. Sergeant Hayes had agreed to join the operation after examining Thunderwalker's documentary evidence, his military experience, recognizing the authentic signatures and official seals that confirm the conspiracy's reach into territorial government itself. Mrs. Donovan, I've served 15 years on this frontier, and I've never seen anything like this level of systematic deception, Hayes admitted as he checked his weapons and supplies. If these documents are genuine, we're dealing with treason that could destroy everything decent people have tried to build in this territory. Clara secured Thunderwalker's sacred medicine pouch beneath her riding coat, its weight a constant reminder of the trust that bound her to warriors who had every reason to consider all white people their enemies. The Sauk chief's personal guarantee of protection carried her across cultural boundaries that most frontier inhabitants never imagined crossing. Thunderwalker's warriors appeared at the designated rendezvous point like ghosts materializing from the prairie itself, their silent approach demonstrating the stealth capabilities that had allowed them to conduct surveillance operations without detection. 6 seasoned fighters flanked their war chief, each carrying weapons that blended traditional craftsmanship with captured military equipment. The evil men broke camp before sunrise, Thunderwalker reported, as Clara and Hayes joined the Sauk force. They ride toward Morrison settlement wearing war paint and feathers, but their horses carry Chicago brands, and their leader speaks English when he thinks no Indians can hear. The confirmation that the false flag operation was proceeding as scheduled transformed their mission from theoretical exposure to immediate intervention. Clara realized that within hours they would either prevent a massacre and expose a conspiracy or die attempting to stop enemies with unlimited resources and official protection. Thunderwalker's band moved across the prairie with fluid efficiency that impressed even Sergeant Hayes, whose military training had taught him to appreciate tactical competence regardless of its source. The Sauk warriors rode in formation that maximized speed while maintaining constant surveillance of potential threats, their coordination reflecting years of operating in hostile territory. Clara found herself riding beside Grey Eagle, the senior, a warrior who had served as Thunderwalker's diplomatic envoy during the tense negotiations at her trading station. His weathered face showed approval of her horsemanship and apparent comfort with their dangerous mission, though his dark eyes remained constantly alert for signs of ambush or betrayal. "You ride well for white woman," Grey Eagle observed with grudging respect. "Thunderwalker chose wisely when he decided to trust the one who saved his children. Your courage honors both our peoples." The compliment carried significance beyond simple courtesy, representing acceptance by warriors whose survival had depended on accurate assessment of allies and enemies for decades. Clara understood that earning their respect required demonstrating competence under pressure rather than simply expressing good intentions. As they covered ground toward the Morrison settlement, Thunderwalker's scouts reported regular updates on the false flag operation's progress. The conspirators were maintaining their Indian disguises while following routes that would allow them to approach the isolated homestead without being observed by legitimate travelers or military patrols. They moved like white men, trying to look Indian, one scout reported to Thunderwalker in rapid Sauk, the Grey Eagle translated for Clara and Hayes. Their formation shows cavalry training, and they stopped to consult maps instead of reading the land. The intelligence confirmed what Morningstar had observed during the Stampede attack. White men wearing Indian disguises, but retaining behavioral patterns that revealed their true identities to anyone familiar with genuine tribal warfare. The deception succeeded only because most whites couldn't distinguish between authentic and imitated Indian tactics. Thunderwalker called a halt when his advance scouts reported that the conspirators had reached positions overlooking the Morrison homestead. Through careful observation from concealed positions, the Sauk war chief and his allies could see the false flag operation preparing to execute another manufactured atrocity that would justify military retaliation against innocent tribal groups. Clara studied the scene through Thunderwalker's captured military telescope, counting 12 men in elaborate war paint and feathered headdresses that represented movie theater versions of Indian appearance rather than authentic tribal regalia. Their weapons included new Spencer repeating rifles that no genuine war party could have afforded, while their horses bore brands from Chicago area ranches. "Sergeant Hayes, do you recognize any of those men?" Clara asked, hoping that military experience might identify the conspirators despite their disguises. Hayes examined the false Indians carefully before nodding with grim recognition. "The leader there, the one giving orders, that's Marcus Webb, former cavalry sergeant who was discharged for profiteering. He's been working for civilian contractors who supply territorial militia units." The identification of Webb as a military veteran explained the professional coordination visible in the false flag operation, while confirming Thunderwalker's intelligence about the conspiracy's sophistication. These weren't random criminals seeking easy profit, but experienced fighters implementing systematic strategies for eliminating tribal resistance to territorial expansion. Below in the homestead, Morrison family goes about morning chores with no knowledge that death watches from the hills, Thunderwalker observed, with the tactical precision that had made him legendary among both allies and enemies. In 1 hour, false Indians will attack and kill innocent people whose only crime was settling on land that evil men wished to steal. Clara realized that they had perhaps 30 minutes to position themselves for intercepting the attack while gathering evidence that would expose the conspiracy. Success required perfect timing and coordination between allies who had never worked together before, with failure meaning not only their own deaths, but the massacre of an innocent family. Thunderwalker's battle plan demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had earned him recognition as one of the most formidable war chiefs on the frontier. His strategy would allow them to capture several conspirators alive while preventing the attack on the Morrison family, providing the living witnesses necessary to expose the broader conspiracy. "My warriors will circle behind the false Indians while they prepare for attack," Thunderwalker explained to Clara and Hayes. "When they begin their descent toward the homestead, we strike from 2 directions, capturing their leader and several followers before they can escape or destroy evidence." The plan required Clara and Sergeant Hayes to position themselves where they could observe and document the capture operation, providing the military testimony necessary to validate whatever confessions or evidence the prisoners might provide. Their role as witnesses carried less immediate physical danger, but greater long-term risk from conspiracy members who remained at large. Clara checked her pistol and rifle one final time, knowing that the next hour would determine whether justice prevailed or corruption continued destroying innocent lives throughout the territory. Thunderwalker's warriors moved into position with the silent efficiency of predators approaching unsuspecting prey, their years of warfare providing skills that no amount of military training could replicate. As the false Indians began their final approach toward the Morrison homestead, Thunderwalker raised his hand to signal the attack that would either expose the conspiracy or eliminate the last witnesses to its existence. Clara held her breath as 2 civilizations' worth of accumulated grievances and misunderstandings approached resolution through violence that could save or damn them all. The first war cry that shattered the morning silence came not from the false Indians preparing to massacre an innocent family, but from Thunderwalker himself as he led his warriors in an attack that would either bring justice or destruction to everyone involved in their desperate alliance. The battle erupted with shocking swiftness as Thunderwalker's warriors struck the conspirators from multiple directions simultaneously. Clara watched in amazement as Sauk fighters demonstrated combat skills that transformed them from outnumbered underdogs into dominant predators, their coordinated assault overwhelming enemies who had expected to face only helpless civilians. Marcus Webb's false Indians found themselves trapped between Thunderwalker's main force and Grey Eagle's flanking attack, their cavalry training useless against opponents who fought with the desperation of people defending their very survival. Within minutes, half the conspirators lay dead or captured, while the survivors fled in panic toward distant tree lines. Sergeant Hayes documented everything with the precision of a career soldier, his detailed observations providing the military testimony that would validate Thunderwalker's accusations before territorial authorities. The evidence gathering continued, even as the battle raged, with Clara helping to secure weapons, documents, and other proof of the conspiracy's scope and organization. Thunderwalker himself captured Marcus Webb alive, the Sauk chief's tactical brilliance evident in his success at taking the operation's leader prisoner rather than simply killing him. Webb's survival would provide the key witness necessary to expose corruption, reaching the highest levels of territorial government, assuming they could keep him alive long enough to testify. "Tell your masters that Thunderwalker knows their names and their crimes," the war chief announced to his captive with fierce satisfaction. "Justice comes for all who profit from innocent blood, whether they wear war paint or government uniforms." Marcus Webb's confession under Thunderwalker's interrogation revealed the conspiracy's scope in horrifying detail. Faced with the choice between Sauk justice and territorial courts, the former cavalry sergeant chose cooperation, naming Governor Porter, 3 territorial legislators, and a dozen Chicago businessmen as architects of the systematic campaign to eliminate tribal land rights through manufactured warfare. Clara documented every revelation, while Sergeant Hayes prepared official military reports that would bypass corrupted territorial channels and reach federal authorities in Washington. The evidence they had gathered would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of frontier government, while vindicating Thunderwalker's people of crimes they had never committed. "Mrs. Donovan, this changes everything we thought we knew about frontier conflicts," Hayes admitted as he reviewed Webb's signed confession alongside Thunderwalker's documentary evidence. Half the Indian wars in this territory were probably orchestrated by white criminals seeking profit from the bloodshed. Chaka captured weapons and forged tribal artifacts provided additional proof of the deception's sophistication. The conspirators had invested considerable resources in creating convincing false flag operations, commissioning fake Indian regalia and weapons that would fool casual observers while generating the outrage necessary to justify military retaliation against innocent communities. Thunderwalker's satisfaction at exposing his people's enemies was tempered by recognition that justice remained uncertain despite the overwhelming evidence. Corruption that reached territorial government could still suppress investigations or eliminate witnesses before federal authorities could intervene effectively. Webb's words prove Sauk innocence, but evil men have power to silence truth if we are not careful, Thunderwalker observed, with the practical wisdom that had kept his people alive through decades of impossible circumstances. "We must move quickly before the conspiracy's leaders learn that their operation has been exposed." Dr. Harrison's unexpected arrival at the Morrison homestead provided the crucial element that transformed their evidence from frontier accusations into federal cases requiring immediate investigation. The elderly physician had been summoned by Martha Morrison, after she witnessed the strange battle between painted warriors, and his presence as a respected territorial citizen legitimized the extraordinary events Clara and Hayes reported. Federal marshals from Chicago arrived at your trading station this morning, Dr. Harrison informed them breathlessly. Someone in Washington has been investigating territorial corruption for months, and your evidence provides exactly what they needed to move against Governor Porter's entire network. The federal intervention explained the timing that had made Thunderwalker's intelligence operation possible. Washington authorities had been tracking suspicious patterns in territorial military expenditures and land acquisitions, recognizing signs of systematic corruption without being able to identify the specific mechanisms being employed. Clara's alliance with Thunderwalker had provided the breakthrough that federal investigators needed while demonstrating that honest cooperation between white and Native American communities could achieve justice that neither group could secure independently. Their unprecedented partnership offered a model for future relationships based on mutual respect rather than mutual destruction. Marshal James Crawford is Porter's brother, but he's also an honest lawman who's been investigating his own family's involvement in territorial corruption, Dr. Harrison continued. Your evidence gives him the proof necessary to arrest everyone involved, including his brother if necessary. As federal marshals took custody of the captured conspirators and documented evidence, Thunderwalker prepared to honor the debt he owed Clara for saving his children and exposing the conspiracy that had threatened his people's survival. The maid ceremony he proposed would formalize their alliance while establishing precedents for future cooperation between their communities. Woman who saved my children, you have proven that courage and honor exist among white people just as wisdom and justice exist among all peoples, Thunderwalker announced with formal dignity before the assembled witnesses. I name you sister to the Sauk nation with all rights and protections that kinship brings. The adoption ceremony Thunderwalker conducted transformed Clara from an isolated frontier trader into a recognized intermediary between civilizations, her new status carrying obligations and opportunities that would shape the rest of her life. The sacred pipe they shared symbolized bonds that transcended cultural boundaries while creating pathways for peaceful coexistence. Morning Star presented Clara with a magnificent deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of their rescue and alliance. The garment's symbolic elements would identify Clara as someone under Sauk protection, while honoring her role in exposing the conspiracy that had threatened both peoples. My children will remember the white woman who chose truth over safety, Morning Star said as she embraced Clara with genuine sisterhood. Their children's children will know that courage can bridge any distance between hearts that seek justice. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of her rebuilt trading station, watching as the first mixed wagon train of white settlers and Sauk families departed for jointly established communities in the Oregon Territory. The cooperative settlements represented a new model for frontier development based on shared resources and mutual protection rather than competition and conflict. Governor Porter's trial had exposed the conspiracy's scope while demonstrating that justice could prevail when honest people refused to accept comfortable lies about their supposed enemies. The federal investigations had led to dozens of arrests across 3 territories, effectively dismantling the network that had profited from manufactured warfare. Thunderwalker's band had established winter camps near Clara's trading station, their presence providing security for honest travelers while creating opportunities for cultural exchange that benefited both communities. The children from both groups played together daily, learning each other's languages and customs in ways that promised a more peaceful future. Clara wore Morning Star's ceremonial dress as she watched the departure of families who had learned to see each other as partners rather than threats. The sacred medicine pouch Thunderwalker had given her remained close to her heart, a tangible reminder of the courage that had transformed enemies into allies through simple acts of human decency. The triplets ran past her porch, their laughter mixing with that of settler children as they chased each other through games that knew no cultural boundaries. Swift Arrow, Rising Moon, and Little Wolf had grown strong and confident under their parents' love, But they had also learned that courage sometimes meant trusting strangers who offered help when it was needed most. As evening settled over the Illinois prairie, Clara reflected on the journey that had begun with a cattle stampede and evolved into something far greater than she had ever imagined possible. She had saved 3 children from disaster, but in doing so, she had discovered that saving others often meant saving something essential within oneself. Thunderwalker appeared beside her with the silent grace that had made him legendary, his presence a reminder that honor recognized honor regardless of the forms it took. "Sister," he said simply, the single word carrying all the gratitude and respect that bound them together. Clara smiled as she watched the sun set over a frontier that had been transformed by the revolutionary idea that different peoples could choose cooperation over conflict when courage overcame fear. The future remained uncertain, but it was a future they would face together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.